It's a pleasure for me to be here. I have to admit I'm a bit spaced out because I'm happy to have made it in Tübingen and not Thüringen. There was, yeah, at some point I got confused. Better than last time when I was supposed to fly to Frankfurt. I kept checking for the flight to München that happened 2 years ago. Where's that bloody flight to München? I ended up in Frankfurt. It's okay. So spaced out as I am going to try to talk about narrative compensation in video games, which is a concept that, as you shall see, is very, very relevant for immersion. Now, this is a concept of immersion that I will present to you, which is very tenable to AAA video games, especially the action-adventure genre. But I would encourage you to think to what extent this theory of immersion and the contribution of narrative compensation can be productive for more serious games and for more indie games, because I think it is, as we shall see. So, if you're a game designer, right, and you're making a big budget video game, first of all, first rule of thumb, no risks, because if the producer invests hundreds of millions of dollars, you want that game to sell. So basically what you will do, you will try to have you will try to immerse the player. By how? Well, first, you will want your game to have a high level of immediacy, right? So that is the level of realism. You want the player to have a gameplay experience where you have a game engine which has very complex physics, and then the visual representation is realistic, while also being very stunning. So you're very keen on being very hooked on this dominant Western understanding of realism, right? Things have to look, sound believable. On top of that, because it's a video game, you want it to be interactive, very interactive. But when I say interactive, I'm talking about relevant ludonarrative agency. So remember Espen Arset's concept of ergodicity. So you want the player to have as many core mechanics at their disposal as possible, because allegedly, the broader the horizon of interaction for the player, the broader the agency, therefore the more enjoyable the experience, they say. Finally, and this might remind those of you who attended my last lecture, my online talk, you want games to have a high degree of narrativity. This was not the rule of thumb 20 years ago when 3D gaming started to be the norm, but especially since 5th generation consoles, the idea of having a good story there has become the norm, to the point that, you know, when there's a major game being released today, there is a gameplay trailer and a story trailer. So clearly both experiences are important. And I will bore you with my saying that we're talking about games that try to adhere to our dominant Western understanding of narrative, because, you know, I do post-colonial studies. I will lose my job if I don't say it. No, I'm joking. I strongly believe what I say here. So when we talk about story in video games, it's a global medium. So we're again very hooked in the industry on this Western idea. And I talk to future game designers every week. So yeah, it's hard to get them out of the Western mindset when making video games. Right. So where does this lead to? This leads to what I call immersion via maximization. So in the industry, the idea is that I call this the GTA syndrome. The more, the better, right? Give them more realism, give them more opportunity to interact with the game world, give them more narrativity, have a narrative designer for the main plot, and a narrative designer for the subplots, and then a narrative designer for the dialogues, and then have a lead game designer who will coordinate all those narrative designers and make sure everything abides by the Freytag's pyramid and the 3-act structure that was patented in the golden age of Hollywood, and that is still with us. So what's this then? Well, narrative compensation is an immersion strategy, which is also to be observed in AAA video games, especially in survival horror video games, but not only. And it works differently. It works differently in what sense? Well, if maximization is about maximizing everything, narrative compensation starts from this assumption. You create a video game where the level of immediacy and the level of interactivity are low. So Dickens is no longer your biggest friend, Charles Dickens, right? All of a sudden you start enjoying Thomas Pynchon. You replace Bleak House with The Crying of Lot 49, or Lost in the Funhouse by John Barth. So yeah, to make some literary references there. So we're talking about video games here that by means of representation, i.e. the material science, the oral, the visual, and the kinesthetic and the textual science that they get on the screen, they produce this representation that is not very realistic in the dominant Western sense of the term, or in the very Hollywoodian way, right? You're looking for something that is more experimental, more modernist, and you see this, for instance, this was quite a thing in Japan in around the year 2000, when in visual culture in Japan you had what some scholars call Japanese visual modernism. All of a sudden, especially in that very tumultuous era, which was like after 10 years of economic turmoil and shifting media landscape and generation clashes, this social tension was reflected in the visual arts by a rejection of dominant realism and a penchant, en penchant, because we are in the French Institute, a penchant for anti-realism, right? For a type of representation that is not conventionally realist. And in video games, on top of that, you had a type of ludic design, a type of game design focusing on mechanics and controls that did not make you feel empowered, did not enlarge your horizon of action, but rather it diminished it. It made it frustrating. It made it that's the experience they were going for. And a couple of minutes from now, I can tell you from my teaching experience how this really works. Now, so basically you're making a game that is very annoying. How do you make it playable? You have this. You increase the level of narrativity so high. Like, it's very story-based, but it's not story-based like a walking simulator. It's story-based to the extent that the diegetic pleasure compensates for the frustration, sometimes to the point that the frustration makes sense in a diegetic way. Sounds convoluted, but I'll get to it. So basically, it's called immersion via narrative compensation because you have this process of compensation there, right? Now, there are two ways in which you can do this. There's the Resident Evil way, and then there's the Silent Hill way. Today, I'm going to talk about the Silent Hill way. So this is a game which I teach every year. And what I love about my teaching is that it's very it's very practice-based, which is another way of saying how can I make my classes less demanding for me? Have the students do the work for you. So especially at the Echo School of Technology, Digital Arts and Video Games, which is affiliated with Andrei in Scotland, I have 3-hour lectures, and 1 hour is they play. And what I do is that, 1 hour I teach the theory, then I list a series of questions, and I have somebody take up the game. Now, the game is actually installed on this very laptop. That's what they play on, so we screen it. And it's always fascinating to see how this game works on the player, because basically I want to have somebody from the students play the game, because walkthroughs don't work. You need to see the gameplay experience, the kinesthetic embodied experience for the students in attendance to understand how the rhetoric works. And it's interesting how, it's like on Twitch, the body and the expressions and the comments of the player become part of the experience, and they give you so much to work on when you analyze the game rhetoric. And what I like about this game very much is that God, you should like their facial expressions where they're like, oh, what's this? Oh my God! And although basically the game seems broken to them, they still want to play. They play and they play and they play, and they're always sad when I tell them, okay, now we need to stop. They want to keep playing, although it's frustrating, although you can't see anything. The camera angles are the controls are counterintuitive. The camera angles prevent you from doing anything. And still you want to play. You want to play. Why? Because this game has a very high degree of narrativity. And its high degree of narrativity consists in the following thing. what you basically have is a narrativization of the core mechanics, which engender both the procedural representation of the protagonist, but also the way in which the world is represented, the way in which the game world is represented to the player. Now, how does this work? Well, it works because the game designers were very smart at putting everything together, evidently. But to be more specific, it works because this is a game that engenders what in media studies we call modal consonance. So yes, the combat mechanics are broken in the sense that, to begin with, your stats as a playable character are pretty low, so you can't take much damage, you can't hit very hard, but then the very process of aiming and hitting and giving the final blow are not very efficient. So even if you do what the game agent wants you to do, you're probably not gonna do it because it's either buggy because they couldn't program it right, or they programmed it wrong on purpose. Fact is, on a phenomenological experiential level, you perceive everything as being so cumbersome, right? So complicated. This makes sense. Why? This makes sense because the game is very good at telling you from the beginning that we are dealing with, first of all, a story world which kind of defies expectations on a very basic cognitive level, you know, where basic understanding of space and time don't apply to the world that you're in. And then the very first cutscene and the very first moments of controlling the character do this very well. Then the very premise, the very inciting moment of the game really makes you question, for example, the psychological status of the protagonist. So this is somebody who has gone to Silent Hill because they claim they've received a letter from their dead wife. Now, dead people can't write letters, so there's something wrong here, right? Now, there being something wrong, suggesting that we're dealing with a protagonist who is psychologically distressed, then gives us a narrative frame for making sense of the core mechanics. It wouldn't make the diegetic profile of the protagonist is so coherently and persuasively built that it would make no sense for you to be able to play the game like you would play Devil May Cry 4, because if you could control James Sunderland like you control Dante in Devil May Cry 3 or Nero in Devil May Cry 4, that would be absurd. So the clunkiness and the absurdity of the level design ironically contributes to the immersion of the player. And a core element in this is, of course, the issue of suspense, which I talked about last time. I split it into three types. And what this game does very well, and we will get to this tomorrow, where we have a longer discussion on that. It works very well on suspense, both in terms of story, right? Oh my God, what's gonna happen next? Your typical detective story, what's gonna happen next, or how did we get to the point where we are now in the story? But it's interesting how this game, how suspense works as the interface between story-driven suspense and mechanic-driven suspense. So this game is suspenseful also on the level of, so how am I gonna get from point A to point B? Not so much in terms of player strategy, but what am I gonna press? There is this tension of what am I gonna press, and it's interesting to see how, you know, how each year I have different players playing the game at least two programs dealing with video games, and that's half the time when I do, oh my God, what am I gonna press now? And there always is the fan in the back who's played it 10 times, like, press that button, you know, but it's never obvious for the person playing for the first time. And this constant doubt with respect to how can I do anything with these controls, again, contributes to the suspenseful gameplay experience. So this is an alternative way to achieve player immersion, because first of all, I think that it sort of gives you a way out of this, you know, dominant understanding of of game design focusing so much on functionality in a very conventional way, and gives you a lot of room to experiment with functionality and work more on the creative and communicative side. Because what I argue in my book that I would talk to you about for 20 seconds towards the end, is precisely this. What narrative compensation gives you is basically the tools for you to communicate serious stuff to players, whether be it in a AAA video game, or be it in a serious game, or in an indie game. But what survival horror games did in the late 90s and early 2000s were, in a broader media context that was very skeptical towards Western cultural influence in general, question the very notion of playability, right? And through narrative compensation, we can actually go as far as to work with gameplay norms in a manner that is not, which does not communicate to the player on a basic meta level purely. So I don't know. Think of I don't know. If you read Life Story by John Barth, the famous short story, it's like a meta narrative. It's a mise en abîme, right? So the whole pleasure of reading that is not because there's an exciting plot there. You read it because, oh, it's so quirky and ironic and so self-aware of the narrative techniques employed. With narrative compensation, you've got that, the meta reception, but you've also got the story, which can communicate effectively and persuasively and emotionally and emphatically. And yeah, so I believe that we can rely on narrative compensation for more serious games or games that are very progressive in the way they relate to dominant cultural issues. And I did say I will talk for 20 seconds about the book where I discussed this whole theory. So I will shamelessly promote my books now. This is this book, Immersion Narrative and Gender Crisis in Survival Horror Video Games, is the book where I discuss this issue of narrative compensation at length and see how it evolves throughout the decades. This one has been released in paperback. You can actually buy it. This one, Video Games Between Postcolonialism and Postcommunism, is coming out this month at the Goethe. Don't buy it yet because it's expensive, hardcover. Just recommend it to your library. Wait for the paperback and buy that one. Also, I'm getting royalties of the paperback. Okay, right. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. You can also follow me on social media, because why not?
Thank you so much, Dr. Naim. Any questions for Andrei from the audience? Yes. I know we'll have questions here.
My question depends on if you played or studied Silent Hill F.
Yes, I have, because I had to give an interview to a magazine from Northwestern University Chicago, so they made me play it, so I did. Thank you, Northern University Chicago.
So I wanted to ask, I actually haven't played it yet, but I've heard that it differs from the originals with its combat system, and it's also with the narrative structure, and I wanted to ask if you think it hindered the gameplay or the story or the themes, or if it improved upon it, or secret third thing, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The situation of Silent Hill F, especially from the point of view of an ethical game design or a game design that is more serious, although being mainstream, is quite an important one. And I have to say that I was not expecting the game to be so good, ethically speaking. Now, why is it so good? Well, first of all, the conception behind it really I was not expecting game designers to be so aware of feminism. I mean, they must have had somebody who has a PhD in feminism and ethics, because that was so good. It's a very bold game, because this is evidently a game. First of all, it's a game that as a game design principle, it successfully manages to retain the ambiguity of games that you had back 20 years ago, like Silent Hill 1, but also be entrenched in this, what I call the aesthetics of clarity of fourth wave feminism. You can read about that in my article, but I don't want to talk about that for half an hour. But fact is that it manages to bring the past into the present in a manner that doesn't cancel the merits of the past, but also doesn't make the whole rhetoric of the game repetitive. That's one thing. Now, this very complex feminist message, which I'm not going to spoil for you because you should play it. It's fun. Is it reflected on a ludic, on a mechanical level? I don't know. I would have to think about it. Clearly, we are dealing with a game that is way more functional than the previous one, so it's not that radical in this respect. However, as with all recent, what I call post-classical survival horror video games, there are ways in which this is a game which tries to make the gameplay experience difficult for you, and the way it makes it difficult is of course, like with The Last of Us Part 2, like with many horror games which have been published over the recent years and which have a social and ethical dimension to them, they do push you to read that cumbersome gameplay metaphorically as an allegory for something. Whether it's an allegory for being queer wherever, or it's an allegory for being a woman in a patriarchal Japanese society in the 60s, whether. I would go as far as to say that Silent Hill F, like many survival horror video games, seem to be very much resonant with what Bo Ruberg in Queer Theory calls too close reading. You know, like make things very ambiguous, give the player a lot of space, and let the player fill that space with whatever meaning they see fit. Which also works commercially very well, you know, because if you play The Last of Us Part 2 and you have the experience of being queer, then evidently you will project your hardships onto the gameplay of the protagonist and sort of metaphorically see it in that way. If you're a hardcore gamer, you're just playing a hardcore game that is difficult and makes you feel a hardcore gamer. So there's a twist to this strategy too. I hope this kind of answers your question.